Hello, everyone. Welcome to yours and my favorite part of the week. That's right, it is your online health psychology course, and I'm here to walk you through the hottest topics in alcohol and drinking. That's right, pour one out tonight because we are going to talk about the history of alcohol use in the United States and review literature that examines the impact and potentially reasons why people become addicted to alcohol or, in general, just drink alcohol. With all that said, let's jump into it. Beginning with cultural differences in attitudes to alcohol. Over the last 100 years, there have been periods of prohibition in other countries, including India and the United States of America. In many countries, there have been great fluctuations between highly restrictive and permissive policies. The World Health Organization reported that 3.3 million deaths in 2012 were due to harmful use of alcohol. Increases people's risk of developing more than 200 diseases, including liver cirrhosis and some other types of cancer. Heavy drinking is a predictor of violence and injuries as well. Overall, 5.1% of the global burden of disease and injury is attributed to alcohol, as measured in disability-adjusted life years, that is, dailies. All right, so just kind of establishing basic overview of stakes here and overview of kind of historical trends. We have obviously prohibition, which we'll talk about in the United States in this lecture, and at other times where alcohol laws are far more permissive, and obviously we have different laws across different countries. If you're in Europe, the laws typically are 18 years of age to drink. United States, 21 years of age. And then we have this kind of global stat here, about 3 million deaths linked to harmful use of alcohol in 2012. Continuing on, we're kind of broad right now. I'm going to present this argument called the body economic argument. This is from David Stuckler, who is a PhD MPH, a professor of political economy in sociology at Oxford University. What his research is about is kind of investigating the historical kind of correlation, I should say, between different macro environmental factors, political trends, so like how laws, stuff like that, and economic trends, so how prosperous a country is a country going through a recession, depression, stuff like that, as well as kind of social, cultural factors as well, and how that's connected to health-related behaviors and outcomes. And specifically, he looks at the impact of kind of like recessions and depressions on suicide rate, for example. And suicide can often, a predictor of suicide can be kind of like heavy alcohol use. Obviously, the most people who engage in alcohol use or heavy alcohol use do not commit suicide, but this is kind of a predictor. And basically, just a couple figures here showing the rates of suicide increasing during the Great Depression in the United States, and then the New Deal kind of decreasing suicide rates. You also see similar trends in East Asia, broadly stated, in Italy, wherein economic recessions or depressions being tied to health-related outcomes. So again, kind of just consistent with the theme of this course, that these kind of broader macro-level historical events influencing health-related behaviors and health outcomes. Moving on to the United States specifically, Esser in 2022 revealed that between 2015 and 2019, excessive alcohol use resulted in roughly 140,000 deaths per year in the United States. About 40% of those deaths had acute causes, such as car crashes, poisonings, and homicides. The majority were caused by chronic conditions attributed to alcohol, such as liver disease, cancer, and heart disease. So this is a pretty large number, generally ranked in the top 5 sources of mortality, depending on the year, higher ranking in that top 5. So pretty large number here. We obviously know about like DUI situation here, wherein alcohol use decreases kind of physical reaction time, kind of like spatial perception, which is going to increase the risk for car crashes and deaths as well. Then we have kind of like ODs as well. But kind of the majority, according to this research, alcohol use, deaths resulting from chronic conditions. So kind of the wear and tear of your body over time. Kind of a classic one is kind of liver disease being predicted by kind of chronic alcohol use. Before the 19th century, heavy drinking was normally viewed as a moral flaw, much the same as all forms of excessive behavior. Beginning around 1826 in the US and then spreading to many other countries, temperance societies promoted the view that alcohol is an addictive substance and that alcoholics are essentially helpless victims of a disease of addiction. Of particular historical importance were the Washingtonians in the US. Self-help organizations running regular meetings along the lines of religious revivalist groups, with an emphasis on the confessions of the repentant sinner and an appeal to the, quote, higher power for support. Tradition remains strong today in Alcoholics Anonymous, that is AA, which has branches in almost every North American and British town of any size, and also in many other countries. So we have kind of this understanding of drinking as some kind of like moral flaw. Now, granted, at the time, you talk about drinking, people were drinking a lot back then, much more than they were now. If you watch depictions of old TV shows that are made now based in this time period or, like 1920s and stuff like that, a lot of drinking going on back then. But, however, it was often viewed as a moral flaw. This kind of gets replaced or I guess subsumed into this kind of this temperance societies here, wherein we're seeing people or alcoholics being taken over, like they're helpless due to this kind of addiction. But you can still see kind of like a bit of a moral framing, but just filtered through kind of these religious terms, wherein this person may be helpless or something. Something is like attacking them, something along those lines. It was like a possession situation, and wherein you're appealing to whatever their god is, and that support, that religious support will help this person fight off those, like demons is kind of like a classic kind of terms, fighting your demons against addiction. And you could see, or I should say that those kind of like foundations are still present today in kind of one of the most common addictions related to alcoholism treatment kind of groups, that is Alcoholics Anonymous. Which will eventually bring us to the total abstinence argument here. Again, people are drinking a lot at this time. While some temperance societies, as the name seems to imply, were in favor of moderations, others took the view that alcohol was so addictive that government should ideally ban it, or at least restrict availability to a severe degree. Other groups promoted the view that alcohol was only highly addictive to certain, quote, at-risk individuals, probably for genetic reasons, were bound to become alcoholics if they started to drink. This is referred to as, quote, the disease model of alcoholism. So like all these kind of groups, and this is all groups across all societies, there's going to be kind of different like waves in it, different kind of like factions in it, different schools of thoughts within this kind of umbrella group here. So we have some people basically arguing just completely ban it, while others are saying, I don't know if we should ban it because, maybe I like drinking, I don't know. But there are certain people maybe who are at risk for whatever reason. That risk, identifying who is at risk obviously can be wrapped up in kind of greater social understandings of other people, aka like racism, sexism, whatever, but also, or like poor people, or maybe just kind of just like people in the whatever, like a different view of it, maybe just as like fringe people on society, something along those lines, something about them putting them at risk. And thus, if those people who are maybe born at risk, they are highly susceptible to alcoholism. They have a, you can think of it like they have a low immune system, and if they're anywhere near the disease of alcohol, they're going to catch alcoholism. The disease model is one favored by AA, and largely as a result of AA's influence, is still the one most often supported by the medical profession, especially in the US. It implies that alcoholics can never return to normal levels of, quote, social drinking, but can only avoid alcoholism by committing themselves to a lifetime of total abstinence. Now, this kind of AA model is definitely most prominent in Anglo countries, so English-speaking world. So UK and the United States. These were kind of areas where very, very, very influential. Again, you can see kind of wrapped up in kind of Protestant like values and stuff like that. So it's going to influence it. So because again, some people are just whatever, born at risk for whatever reason, they cannot have alcohol at all. Because it will ultimately, you have one sip and boom, you're right back to alcoholism is kind of the idea. Thus, kind of total abstinence. And then kind of the idea is like, okay, how do you enforce total abstinence? Well, we can just have the government like ban it is kind of how that progression of logic works, or one pathway at least. Now, that's not to say that, again, alcoholism wasn't a problem at the time. There's kind of different historical analysis studies kind of trying to figure out. Some people kind of link it to kind of industrialization, which brought massive social change, reformulating like literally how society runs. And kind of one argument and interpretation is that kind of alcoholism kind of linked to kind of coping with those big societal changes. It was kind of or I should say potentially according to this interpretation, kind of an externality associated with these big, again, kind of macro changes. So people maybe not being able to fully express what's going on, or just kind of coping with it directly, kind of using alcohol. And at the time, obviously, especially talking in the United States, women's rights much lower, and then you have kind of high rates of alcoholism, kind of that social instability, and that can obviously often manifest in kind of like a domestic violence situation. So that's kind of like the global overall like context that this is taking in. Again, industrialization is happening, changes are happening in this country. You're coming out of the Civil War in the United States. Alcohol use potentially rising. Again, it's kind of difficult to collect data, from 1700s. And then the question is, okay, what do you do about it, and how do you interpret these kind of rate increases and kind of big shifts in instability in kind of your social conditions at the time? And one way to deal with that is total abstinence. Moving on to more present attitudes, analysis of the research findings on the health hazards of drinking is considerably more complicated than is the case for smoking. This is because the dangers to health of alcohol consumption are not always found for light and moderate drinkers, who may even experience health benefits compared with non-drinkers. So in general, the health research is overwhelmingly clear for smoking. Smoking is bad for you, breaking news, and much more directly connected to negative health outcomes. The alcohol literature is a lot more mixed. Granted, it's becoming more clear according to some researchers. So thus why you'll see, light drinking may be beneficial or something like this. But trying to interpret that data and why some research suggests that is a process that's been ongoing. And we'll kind of talk about that more as we work our way through this. So let's stop here and go over operational definitions of what a drink is, a unit of alcohol is, because it's going to vary by country due to a whole host of reasons, such as like medical regulations and stuff like that. So in the UK, 1 unit equals about 8 grams of alcohol, or 1 glass of wine, half a pint of beer, which is about 235 milliliters, or 1 shot of liquor, that is 25 milliliters. Light drinking is defined as approximately 1 unit per day, so basically 1 glass of wine per day. Moderate drinking, approximately 3 units for men and 2 units for women. While heavy drinking is approximately 7 units for men and 5 units for women. In the US, light drinking is considered 3 or fewer drinks per week. Moderate drinking is considered 3 to 7 drinks for women, while 3 to 14 drinks for men. Heavy drinking is on average 8 drinks weekly for women and 15 drinks weekly for men. Now, keep in mind also that the shots of liquor are different in the United States compared to the UK. Not quite double, but you're looking at, just off the top of my head here, 70% difference here, 80% difference. So learned that interestingly in the UK myself during New Year's. It's like, this shot does not seem as strong, and that is because it's not quite half, but whatever it is, 80%. So thus, keep that in mind if you're traveling. But we have kind of overall kind of this idea of what light drinking is. So depending on the country here, we have UK about quote unquote 1 unit per day, while in the US, we're often kind of framed in kind of a week time frame. And this kind of matters because when you're reading research in different kind of contexts, people will describe light, moderate, heavy drinking in different ways, and also different kind of units. So light drinking, you could say 1 unit in the UK is 1 shot of liquor. Well, that shot of liquor is more volume in the United States. So it can be difficult to kind of interpret findings across contexts. Again, kind of one reason why it's challenging to understand the fully, it kind of decreases the clarity of understanding of the impact of alcohol on health-related outcomes. Let's walk through some health effects related to alcohol use, beginning with liver cirrhosis and acute pancreatitis. Prolonged heavy drinking is believed to be the main cause of liver cirrhosis, a serious condition that frequently results in death. British Department of Health, the Academy of Medical Sciences, both noted a 4 to 5-fold increase in deaths from chronic liver disease in the UK from 1970 to 2000, with over 9-fold increases among men and women. The UK Office of National Statistics estimated that mortality from liver disease has doubled from 1991 to 2007. Recent figures from the UK Office for National Statistics estimate that mortality from liver disease has doubled from 1991 to 2007. Although less well known, acute pancreatitis is another frequently fatal disease that is often caused by heavy drinking. So liver cirrhosis, broadly speaking, is when you're digesting alcohol, there's kind of damage to your liver, and through time, this kind of scars, and then kind of repeated scarring of the liver kind of decreases effectiveness. Thus, through time, decreasing the effectiveness of your liver and putting you at risk of infection, like malnutrition, because it kind of helps you process nutritional foods, and other bleeding kind of issues. I would rate it as a no bueno situation. And there's strong evidence that chronic alcohol use, and especially heavy drinking, the more you drink, in general, it's called a dose response situation, where the more you use something, the greater risk you are. Here we have the more you drink, the greater risk of liver cirrhosis is. And we also kind of see this trend in the United Kingdom since about 1970, especially, wherein we're seeing increases in chronic liver disease, potentially associated with higher rates of drinking during that period of time, which then begs the question, why is that? In this period, kind of leveraging body economic literature is a period of kind of shifts in kind of the world economy, that 1970 period into 2000. So maybe, there's always a whole host of these reasons, but kind of really an acceleration in deindustrialization. Again, potentially people losing jobs, maybe losing kind of like a sense of self or kind of identity with those kind of jobs, and then kind of coping with that maybe through alcohol use or something like this. But there's always multiple potential pathways by which, or reasons why. But this is kind of one theoretical reason. Moving on to cancer, Bagnardi in 2001 considered the evidence for 3 levels of consumption, that is 14, 21, and 28 units a week, and found associations increasing at each level for cancers of the oral cavity and pharynx, larynx, breast, liver, colon, rectum, and stomach cancers. In a more recent study of about 109,000 men and 250,000 women from 8 European countries, Cirrhosis in 2011 estimated that 10% of all cancer cases in men and 3% of cases in women are attributable to alcohol consumption. So in our first study here, again, back to that dose response situation, wherein the more of something, the greater risk you are of these kind of various cancers. And then the more recent study, we see that about 10% of cancers estimated to be linked in men and 3% in women. In general, broadly speaking, men on average drink more alcohol than women. However, also, as already reviewed, what is considered light, moderate, and heavy drinking differs depending on your biological sex, due to kind of hosts of broadly stated kind of fat to muscle ratios and some other biological background stuff that kind of impact your ability to digest alcohol. But again, here, 10% of all cancers in these 8 European countries linked to alcohol, pretty high number. Polydrug use. A significant portion of regular alcohol-using males are also smokers. A meta-analysis showed that there is a positive synergistic, that is Multiplicative. I was only in speech again until I was like, until about high school. Anyway, positive synergistic effect of alcohol and tobacco use for cancer of the esophagus in a 2014 study. Observed combined effect of alcohol and tobacco was almost double the effect that would be happen if synergy did not happen. So polydrug use, basically using multiple drugs at the same time. This study looking at the impact of drinking alcohol and using tobacco, generally smoking it, and it's linked to cancer, specifically of the esophagus, aka the tube that connects basically your mouth to your stomach. And what they found, it was that the polydrug use, that is smoking and drinking, increases the risk of esophagus. So that is, drinking alone is the risk for developing cancer of the esophagus is lower than this polydrug use. And the same thing with tobacco use. So smoking alone has a lower risk of cancer in the esophagus than smoking and drinking combined. And this multiplicative situation just means that it's not just like additive property that is like, I'm just making up something here. Alcohol use is increased your risk of cancer by 1%. Tobacco increases your risk of cancer by 1%. Combined, they are 2%. It's not additive. It is, or it's not like linear. So basically your risk accelerates the more of the substances that you use. So the more substances you use, the higher rate of risk. The risk ratio accelerates. Or I should say, this is kind of consistent with other research. So basically, for example, like adverse child experiences. If you experience like 1 or 2, whatever, you're at lower risk. But once you hit 3, 4 of these kind of big traumatic experiences, your risk starts really, really accelerating. So it's not linear. Also, kind of like climate change, which you see in the ocean, as kind of things. It's synergistic. They're basically, both forces are, or in this case, both drugs are kind of interacting with each other in dynamic ways, increasing that risk at an accelerated pace. So here, again, have evidence of alcohol and tobacco use connected to cancer of the esophagus. Drinking during pregnancy. Alcohol easily passes through the placenta barrier, which kind of acts to maybe like filter out harmful chemicals, enzymes that could impact a developing fetus. But alcohol could pass through that placental barrier pretty easily. Very heavy drinking, consequently, is a significant predictor of fetal alcohol syndrome. Fetal alcohol syndrome is associated with facial abnormalities, lighter birth weight, and reduced growth or stunting. Research suggests that heavy drinking is positively associated with miscarriages, premature birth, low birth weight, and a variety of cognitive behavioral problems in the developing child. So positive correlation being that the more you drink, the higher the risk for premature birth, the higher risk for miscarriages. So both variables working in the same way, up or down, in this case up. And this research suggests that mothers who drink alcohol during pregnancies are more likely to have experienced a high cumulative amount of stress. So again, kind of going back to the ACEs, adverse child experiences, the more ACEs you experience throughout your life, that is before, or I should say throughout your childhood, that is before the 18 years of age, the more likely you are to drink during pregnancy. And this could be interpreting kind of this correlation can go a lot of different ways. Maybe people who experience a lot more ACEs have lower levels of social resources, lower levels of economic resources, lower health literacy, at risk of greater housing instability. So a whole host of things kind of making a person's life more unpredictable and potentially needing to use alcohol to kind of cope with that. But also this research found that experiencing 4 or more ACEs, your odds of drinking accelerate even more. So going back to kind of that multiplicative kind of effect here, again, found with these ACEs and the risk of drinking during pregnancy. Now, looking at the health effects of drinking during pregnancy, we're going to have some contradictory findings, which is why you need to read a lot of literature and then interpret these kind of collections of results. It takes a while to be able to do that, and even then there's obviously different schools of thought and debate. But let's walk through some of them. Gray and Henderson in 2006 found no consistent evidence of adverse effects from low alcohol consumption, although there was some evidence of harmful effects on neurodevelopment of among binge drinking mothers during pregnancy. Kelly et al. In 2013 carried out a 7-year follow-up of about 10.5 thousand children born in the UK between 2000 and 2002 and found no evidence of unfavorable cognitive or behavioral effects on children whose mothers were light drinkers during pregnancy compared with abstainers. So we have two studies here. The first one finding little to no evidence that low alcohol use is associated with adverse outcomes in offspring. Some evidence that some neurodevelopmental issues. In 2013, however, comparing light drinkers to heavy drinkers in the UK, they found no differences in behavioral cognitive outcomes in these children. However, some more recent studies indicate that light drinking, especially in the first trimester, is associated with some negative birth outcomes. Anderson et al. In 2012 reported that light drinkers, as compared with abstainers, showed an increased risk of miscarriages during pregnancy during weeks 13 to 16, but no increase later in the pregnancy. Nick Jar in 2014 found that light drinkers in the first trimester were more likely than abstainers to have premature or low birth weight babies. In a meta-analysis in 2019 from about 230,000 pregnant women found that those exposed to alcohol during pregnancies have a greater risk of miscarriages compared to those who abstain. For alcohol use of 5 or fewer drinks per week, each additional drink per week was associated with a 6% increase in miscarriage risk. So now we have research here that suggests that drinking during the first trimester, that's about week 1 to week 12, associated with risk potentially of low birth weight, which in return, low birth weight is correlated with a host of negative developmental outcomes among children. And being born premature, so lower gestational age, which again is associated with numerous negative outcomes across childhood. Depending on also there's kind of can vary those results, but can just be thought of broadly stated as a risk factor for negative developmental outcomes. Then we see the Anderson study, which found that the risk was in the second trimester, that is weeks of 13 through 16, that is an increased risk of miscarriage among light drinkers. And then the meta-analysis basically found that the more you drink during pregnancy, the greater risk you are for miscarriage risk, or the higher your risk of miscarriage is. So the question is, why the hell do we have contradictory findings? Well, there's different arguments of why we have different contradictory findings. Charnas in 2016 argued drinking during pregnancy is stigmatized and reports of alcohol consumption during pregnancy could be unreliable. So maybe our data is a little bit questionable. Studies differ in their definitions of mild, moderate, and heavy drinking and set different thresholds for each. Some studies focus on drinking in the first trimester, whereas others evaluate the effects of drinking throughout pregnancy. So we could have some kind of issues with reporting the correct rates of drinking. So AKA maybe a mother who is drinking reports that they're not drinking. So then they get sorted into not drinking group. And that makes the non-drinking group, it biases the data because now those two groups are less different from each other because you're actually mixing up people who are drinking, not drinking into incorrect groups, thus kind of minimizing the statistical difference between those groups. Also, as stated, there's different operational definitions for mild, moderate, and heavy drinking, and also different ways to measure drinking. So are you looking at the cumulative amount that you drink across pregnancy? Are you only looking at drinking in the first trimester, second trimester, or third trimester, for example? Others argue that social factors associated with light to moderate alcohol consumption, such as maternal affluence, also impact child development. An enriched postnatal environment may mitigate the adverse effects of an affluent mother's moderate drinking. Fekjar in 2013 argued that most studies have been conducted in countries where light or moderate alcohol consumption is very much the prevailing norm and statistically associated with high social status. While non-drinkers are on average of lower social status and education with less healthy diets and levels of exercise and many other characteristics which are correlated with poor health. So this could be counterintuitive, in fact, to many people, but numerous studies suggest it's not always found to be the case, but that wealthier people drink more than lower class people. You can kind of think of maybe like a Victorian situation. You're pouring a glass of wine, you're drinking, you're doing business, whatever. But studies suggest in the U.S. that have often found that wealthier people drink more. So then what you're doing is then, are you actually comparing comparing people who don't drink and do drink during pregnancy or just overall across their life? Are you often comparing just people who are lower class and higher class? And thus, if you're actually doing that, and that's going to be part of it, you're also picking up other histories of these women in various classes. So kind of more specifically, for example, women in higher class are probably going to have better health care. They're going to have maybe higher rates of exercise, better understanding of health literacy, have higher rates of health literacy. They're going to be more educated. So all these kind of other background factors related to their class are associated with positive developmental outcomes. So they have this collection of factors. They're called protective factors that buffer, aka decrease the probability of a negative outcome associated with a risky behavior. So more specifically, drinking could have less effects, less severe effects among these higher class people because whatever, they have better healthcare, they have better exercise, they just have more resources, social, physical, and economic resources. So really what you're finding, and maybe why light and moderate drinking may not have less of effect, what you're really, it's confounded. It's that it's not really the light drinking that has no effects. It's that these other environmental factors, these other environmental factors, the background histories of these higher class mothers are actually decreasing the effects of light alcohol, decreasing the risk of light drinking. And not only that, but children who maybe are born a little too early for their gestational age, or they're born a little too lightweight. Well, those mothers are going to have the necessary resources to allow that child to undergo healthy catch-up growth. They're going to have the economic resources, the social resources to allow that kid to catch up, thus kind of decreasing the long-term effects of maybe being born a little too light for their age or a little too prematurely. Again, so trying to separate these confounding background resources is very difficult because people don't exist in a vacuum. We can't at birth assign some people, make some mothers drink and be poor, and some mothers not drink and be rich. We don't have control of that. People live their lives. So when we test these things, they're bringing all these kind of background factors that it can be difficult to tease apart. Thus why, one potential reason why it is difficult to understand the quote unquote like accurate, the true effect of alcohol on pregnancy-related outcomes at times. Now, some people have argued that there's evidence for a protective effect of light to moderate drinking, and this is debated. Again, protective effect meaning it is a factor that decreases the risk associated with experiencing something. So in this case here, decreasing the health risk associated with alcohol use. But in general, protective factors just mean it decreases the risk of something and or it decreases the probability of a behavior occurring. So this is many reasons why stress research and kind of like pop psychology is trash often, is that just because you experience a stressor or something does not mean an automatic outcome is going to happen. It doesn't work like that. We also have not just risk factors in traumatic events, but we also have protective factors that, again, buffer is kind of the verb here, decrease the risk associated with a negative experience. Now, some people have argued it's decreased a lot, but a couple of 20 years ago, especially, that light drinking may be a protective effect. It's a good for you, broadly speaking, saying it crudely. Some critics have argued that the interpretation has been distorted by the inclusions among the non-drinkers of more people with pre-existing health problems than among the light to moderate drinkers. So basically what some of these critics argue is that, some of the non-drinkers include people who can't drink because maybe they have a chronic condition wherein if they drink, they die. So thus you're kind of pooling the non-drinkers are also maybe going to include people who already are at higher risk due to whatever, some other chronic condition, or maybe they, unrelated to alcohol, I should say, or chronic condition related to alcohol. So maybe they stopped drinking, they're a non-drinker, but they drank their whole life. And so thus you have a person in the non-drinker group with a lot of liver damage, and you're comparing it to the quote, light drinkers. again, potentially contributing to a misinterpretation of the effects of alcohol consumption. The book authors argue that men and women who drink moderately and have no pre-existing health problems are not taking any significant risk with their physical health. However, a more recent 2023 study from the World Health Organization reported that no amount of alcohol consumption is safe, and interpretations overall are moving in that direction. So this is kind of the risk of why. On the one hand, it's a pain in the ass to buy a new textbook all the time, and it's like a ripoff. But on the other hand, kind of we do get new research, and you kind of have to update it. So kind of the newest, most kind of global understanding, World Health Health report on alcohol use has found that no alcohol assumption is safe. And this is kind of related to, there's many reasons why, but it's ultimately kind of damaging your DNA. The health effects related to accidents. Alcohol consumption has been shown to be a factor in many kinds of injuries, including deaths from falls, fires, industrial accidents, and drowning. The importance of drunk driving as a cause of road traffic accidents and the deaths of drivers, passengers, and pedestrians is universally acknowledged. Risk begins even at the lowest blood alcohol levels and increases proportionately. So alcohol consumption, the physical effects of alcohol use, really not debated. It's kind of consensus. People much more likely to fall, for example, and if you're doing something very risky, you're going to be at risk of like killing yourself, climbing something very high or working with some kind of dangerous equipment, something like that. And then drinking and driving, kind of decreased reaction time, spatial awareness already stated, increases with alcohol use. Moving on to the psychosocial effects related to alcohol use. Anderson and Bomberg in 2006 reviewed an extensive range of studies from many countries demonstrating an association between heavy drinking and a variety of personal and social problems, including violent assaults and homicide, marital violence and marital breakdown, child abuse, impaired work performance, depression, and suicide. The effects of alcohol were also found to be influenced by culture and people's expectations about potential benefits, including enjoyment, stress reduction, and increased sociability. What we expect, in other words, to happen when drinking also can play a role in our social behavior while drinking. This can include aggression, excuse to flirt, non-social behaviors, however, such as reaction time, are more influenced by alcohol itself than expectations. So stopping there momentarily, we have this 2006 study wherein heavy alcohol use found to be correlated with social problems, work problems, and kind of domestic violence against children and your spouse as well. But it's also important to keep in mind that people who engage in a heavy alcohol drinking usually have other things going on in their life. You're rarely getting like blackout drunk every single day if you're feeling great. You have all kinds of other things going on in your life, and then you're using alcohol use on top of that for a variety of reasons. And then kind of so you have this collective toxic cocktail of life circumstances plus heavy alcohol use contributing to these negative developmental outcomes. Now, interesting kind of culture and people's expectations of what the impact of alcohol affects how they behave while drinking alcohol. So kind of the classic guy, we all know this guy who's like, oh man, when I drink tequila, I gotta fight, man, I gotta fight. And kind of research suggests that yes, if you have that expectation that you're going to be aggressive while drinking, you're more likely to be aggressive while drinking. While people who do not have that expectation of aggression are less likely to engage in aggressive behavior, or just like flirting or whatever, like, oh, I'm super flirty, whatever, during this time. People who believe that are more likely to engage in like flirtatious behavior. Now, however, expectations do not apply again to kind of more of those physical reaction time or physical abilities. So like reaction time, you can't be like, you know what, when I drink, I'm the best driver of all time, and all of a sudden you're a great driver and you can you can drive amazingly while drunk. It doesn't really work that way. We're really talking about social expectations here. Continuing on, setting, participants tested in a bar or bar-like situations with drinking companions feel more friendly and elated when they drink and consume up to twice as much alcohol as participants who drink by themselves, according to the study. Alcohol dependence is higher among people suffering from anxiety disorders, and the use of alcohol to induce sleep is also known to aggravate sleep disorders because it increases wakefulness and arousal a few hours later. So the setting where you're drinking can also impact the rates of alcohol use. So in this study, a person found that drinking with kind of like a friends or someone else increases the rates of drinking. And again, we kind of all understand this. If you're drinking alone versus drinking in a group or at a party or something like that is going to impact how much alcohol a person consumes. We also see anxiety disorders, people with anxiety disorders being more likely to engage or have alcohol dependence, and also people who, so maybe maybe trying to reduce that anxiety. We also see people trying to use alcohol for sleep, to induce sleep, but for various neurological reasons that I'm not going to get into, it doesn't really work that well. You actually kind of can decrease your rates of kind of deep sleep that you need that allows you to feel like rejuvenated in the morning. So thus, while often you sleep like a long time while drinking a lot, you can wake up and be like, oh, I'm still really tired. This is kind of thought to be associated with alcohol kind of interfering with certain brain waves while sleeping. Genetic theories propose that some people have an inherent predisposition to develop drinking problems, hereditability. Most widely cited evidence for genetic influences come from twin and adoption studies, which have been used to estimate, quote, hereditability, a statistical assessment of the relative importance of hereditary and environmental influences, which takes values from 100%, that is fully inherited characteristics, to 0%, which are purely environmentally determined. A 2002 study from Walters carried out a meta-analysis of 50 studies and concluded that hereditability was quite low for alcohol, heavy alcohol use or drinking people with drinking problems, about 30 to 35 or 36%, so whatever, 33%. A newer 2015 study, these authors argued that the number is closer to 50%. So basically, what's in the influence of genes on alcohol use, and without getting too deep into it, the hereditability ranges and study of anything, but here alcohol use can wildly fluctuate, as you can see here, ranging from 30 to 50%. Many authors argue, or I said, the schools of thought that basically argue that these hereditability studies are not completely bogus, but misinterpreted and misleading. Thus, you really can't gather that much information from hereditability, but kind of these is kind of our theoretical possible range. But as we talked about before in previous lectures with the missing hereditability issue, there has been a great number of attempts to demonstrate specific genetic loci for alcohol problems, but those have only been met with modest success. As with other forms of human behavior, there are likely to be a multitude of complex genetic routes that may make some individuals more likely than others to become problem drinkers. On the basis of existing research evidence, there's no reason to suppose that some people are, quote, born alcoholics. Although there is enough evidence to show that there is some degree of genetic predisposition towards different patterns of drinking, it seems unlikely that this is important as the influence of environmental factors. So the missing hereditability problem is kind of like this idea of like, okay, we have this number of theoretical hereditability, something linked to genetics influencing this behavior, but basically an inability to identify specific genes related to this behavior. So then the question is, what does that mean? And then there's different kind of interpretations and arguments related to that. But kind of broadly stated, like all human behavior, some combination of genes maybe. I mean, granted, there are different schools of thoughts on this. Some combination of genes and kind of the environment influencing each other. And the extent that genes do play a role, it's probably going to be related to much more complex than like, this is the alcohol gene. It's going to be some collection of genes interacting in very complex ways, almost like your brain, how different networks are working together in complex ways that we fully don't understand. In general, the consensus, though, is that environmental influences, factors, life histories are more predictive of alcohol-related drinking problems rather than kind of a gene or genetic theories. But again, there are people who would challenge that as well. Addictive personality. This predisposes someone to abusing drugs. However, and I will unequivocally state, there is no single addictive personality profile. There is no addiction gene that has been reliably found. Common thing that's said online. I have the addiction gene. I have the addiction personality. There is no such thing. This is like a consensus situation. Does not exist. Maybe you'll find in the future. Godspeed. Doesn't exist right now. Not real. However, certain personality traits influence use of drugs. such as maybe impulsivity, tendency to seek high levels of novel and stimulating sensory experiences, anxiety and hostility. However, traits may result from use of drugs. So kind of the idea here of these personality traits is that if you have higher rates of impulsivity, maybe you're more likely to engage in alcoholism or drug abuse, something along those lines. It increases your risk. Now, obviously, the majority of people who have higher than average impulse rates, broadly defined, are not going to become addicts. But maybe it just increases your risk in some ways. So these specific personality traits and cumulatively may increase your risk of being engaging in addictive like behavior, heavy drug use, or heavy drinking. However, again, there is no specific, I have this personality, these sets of specific traits that make me an addict. And there is no single addiction genes. Now, it's important to keep in mind that these personality traits are correlated with each other. So, for example, maybe alcoholism increases anxiety. So maybe it's like a bi-directional effect, wherein maybe you're very anxious, so you start drinking a lot. Drinking a lot makes you more anxious, and then this kind of accelerates. It's kind of the idea here. So continuing on with kind of our historical trajectory of how alcoholism is abused, Rush and really help kind of shepherd in this idea that habitual drunkards are not moral degenerates, to one that they are victims of addiction wherein they lose control over their drinking. Later disease theories focus increasingly on the at-risk individual who has a predisposition to become alcoholic once he or she starts drinking. In common with earlier addiction theories, disease theories emphasize cravings and loss of control. The difference was, for the later disease theorists, alcohol is only highly addictive for a small number of people. From the mid-1970s, the disease theory was revised and extended, becoming the alcohol dependence syndrome. New conceptualization, syndrome was viewed as a psychophysiological disorder. So we mostly covered this already, shifting from moral to disease kind of oriented situation. And on some hands, you can kind of look at this as maybe an increase of maybe like a humanistic view, like more empathy, kind of the idea that, this is not really their fault. It's kind of beyond their kind of control on some regards. And we kind of already discussed these other things here, but we see kind of really picking up in the 1970s, not that it exists before, but this idea of alcoholism or alcohol dependence syndrome being not just physiologically based, but also including kind of a psychological component of it as well. So moving closer to that biopsychosocial model of development that we have today. Sayet in 2017 reviewed the effects of alcohol on emotional expression in social drinkers. This author argued that masculine gender norms in some Western cultures tend to constrain expressions of emotion, especially warmth and affiliation among men. The author argued that men appear to benefit more than women from drinking alcohol, which helps them to, quote, loosen up, smile, share feelings, and interact socially. So kind of the idea here is the norms of men not like expressing feelings or like communicating or something along those lines. So that kind of those masculine gender norms, and the West constrain, again, kind of those emotional expressions and warmth. However, alcohol use kind of gives a opportunity for men to kind of express themselves. So again, you can kind of internalize it, or a man can internalize it as like, oh, alcohol makes me do this. And therefore, now I'm free of those kind of masculine gender norms and can express myself. It's not really my fault. It's kind of the alcohol drinking. But also maybe like a setting where it's like a more festive environment or something like that. And you're drinking, having fun, and you could be more warm. Or maybe it's a depressive environment where you're drinking together in a bar, a long day at work, and you're like, oh, my life, or whatever. You're at a bar. Classic like Cheers situation, if you've ever saw that show. Next, I want to introduce a dislocation theory of addiction. Adherents of this kind of school of thought argue that addiction is an individual and social response to, quote, dislocation, especially severe social, economic, and cultural dislocation. As alternative or opposite of dislocation is psychosocial integration. And it's really kind of working with kind of Erikson's stage theories or other kind of stage theories is kind of based on this dislocation theory of addiction. One of the prominent advocates of this, or adherents to this, scholar Alexander in 2009 argued, bear with me, quote, that dislocation is addiction is a lack or loss of the psychosocial. Dislocation denotes a psychological or social separation from one's society, which can befall people who never leave home, as well as those who have been geographically displaced. Like psychosocial integration, dislocation has been given many names, perhaps the most familiar being alienation or disconnection. Continuing on, people can endure dislocation for a time. However, severe, prolonged dislocation eventually leads to unbearable despair, shame, emotional anguish, boredom, and bewilderment. It regularly precipitates suicide and less direct forms of self-destruction. This is why forced dislocation in the form of ostracism, excommunication, exile, and solitary confinement has been a dreaded punishment from ancient times until the present. Advocates of this theory argue that addiction is an adaptation to dislocation. It is a way of responding to and dealing with dislocation. Among addicts, adaptation does not work well over time. Ultimately, people struggle to adapt to and deal with difficult psychological and social circumstances. So these are always kind of fun things to work with, these kind of big, grand theories of things here. And so now we have kind of this idea of theory of addiction, again, kind of leveraging kind of classic Erikson stage theories, wherein this kind of separation of oneself socially and psychologically from the world around you, kind of increasing your sense of disconnection or alienation from the world around you. We've talked about kind of before with kind of indigenous research, wherein kind of the loss of culture, that sense of belonging, increasing the risk of drug abuse. So in their case, literally being physically dislocated, exiled, removed from their traditional homelands, and at the same time being psychologically disconnected from each other, but maybe at the same time also being disconnected from kind of the larger kind of Western world, and for example, like the United States, something along those lines. And that kind of dislocation, that alienation from the world around you, contributing to a sense of shame, disconnection, despair, and then often boredom. It's a kind of a classic behavior or kind of emotional feeling or experience that's kind of associated with higher likelihood of engaging in substance abuse. So thus, in this case here, addiction is not kind of a medical disease situation, but rather a neurological, genetic, and behavioral adaptation to the world around you. So again, adaptation, as I talked about before, does not mean necessarily good or bad. It just is. You are shaped by your environment. You are working to fit within your environment. You're adapting to your environment. In this case here, you are adapting to an environment that you're disconnected, alienated from, and that can contribute to certain behavioral responses. In this case, maybe higher rates of alcohol use, or when you do drink, getting very, very, very drunk. So you adapt to the circumstances to kind of survive, but through time, that adaptation kind of wears you down, as we talked about kind of the first chapter, and then that kind of wear and tear through time, putting you at higher risk of kind of risky behaviors, such as negative risky behaviors, such as like over drinking or some kind of opioid addiction or something like that. And as such, to address alcoholism or some kind of addiction or whatever, you have to kind of design a society that is kind of that creates connections between people and kind of removes that sense of alienation. Now, what the society would mean, obviously open to kind of debate based on your theoretical and ideological views of the world. Let's move on to substance abuse in the elderly, kind of a topic usually not talked about, or not as, I should say, less talked about than kind of a younger teenage kind of drinking habits, or even 30, 40-year-olds. There are about 2.5 million older adults with an alcohol or drug problem, about 6 to 11% of elderly hospital admissions, 14% of elderly emergency room admissions, and 20% of elderly psychiatric hospital admissions are a result of alcohol or drug-related problems. Research suggests that widowers over the age of 75 have the highest rates of alcoholism in the United States. Nearly 50% of nursing home residents have alcohol-related problems, according to some research. Risk factors for psychoactive substance abuse in elder adults include social isolation, which is associated with depression, death of a spouse/partner, family members and/or friends, retirement, moving, and reduced activity levels are thought to be associated with increased rates of heavy alcohol drinking or drug abuse overall. So here we see a lot of this is a very high numbers according to some research. And especially just pointing out a couple of these here, you can see maybe the impact of widowers. So obviously the death of a spouse. So kind of dealing with that grieving process, but also maybe increasing boredom, going back to that boredom situation, or kind of just social isolation. You're losing someone who, theoretically you've been married to a long time, your best friend or something along those lines. Maybe you're in a nursing home, so you're disconnected from other people or your family that you're, every single day. Again, you lost your partner, husband, wife, whatever, and that can be coped with through alcohol use. So this is kind of the psychological element that I mentioned earlier on about in the 1970s, kind of viewing alcohol use as a psychophysiological thing related to physiological predictors, and then again, kind of related more recently to the biopsychosocial model, and you can connect it to the other theories as well that we've just reviewed. Let's talk about some potential prevention strategies here. Specialists in alcohol problems are almost unanimous in their support for the quote population-based approach that the most effective policies for reducing alcohol problems are those which reduce overall levels of consumptions. So kind of those macro interventions. The World Health Organization in 2007 noted that young people's drinking is particularly sensitive to increases in price, which can therefore reduce underage drinking as well as extent of binge drinking among teenagers. Kind of the idea here is that young people have less money, you increase the cost, and then they literally cannot afford it. And thus increasing the cost of alcohol can decrease the rates of drinking among younger people. Anderson and Bomberg in 2006 examined the impact of restrictions on the sale of alcohol, including increases in the minimum legal age for purchases and measures to restrict number of outlets and days and hours where sale of alcohol is permitted. Some earlier research indicated that bans had little or no effect on overall consumption. However, Safer and Dave in 2002 concluded that advertising and sponsorship bans can reduce overall consumption by 5 to 8%. You also see this kind of like in tobacco use, wherein certain warnings were required, targeting advertisements on TV were restricted, which targeted children, and research suggests that it's kind of linked to decreases in smoking in that case. And in this case here, decreases in consumption of alcohol. Now, interesting, however, I should note that this is before smartphones. So this research probably, we need more research on kind of the impact of those kind of like personalized ads that target people based on kind of a demographic information. Drunk driving laws. One area of legislation to control the dangers of alcohol use is strictly enforce drunk driving laws with severe penalties for offenders. This has been found in a 2013 study to be especially effective in high fatality areas. Health education initiatives as well. Health education generally appears to improve knowledge about the effects of alcohol and attitudes towards it, but small to no effect on the amounts actually consumed. So this is kind of the classic gap between, almost similar to that gap between attention and behavior. So not necessarily knowing more does not necessarily correlated with decrease in the amount of alcohol consumed. And for some drunk driving laws, if you're kind of taking a macro, maybe like for example, like University of Florida, they have the later Gator buses that ride till like I don't remember what it is, 3 a.m. or something like that. That offers free busing for students or something along those lines, and they basically argue that that busing service helps decrease rates of drunk driving in the city. Empowerment. Some scholars have argued empowerment framing contrasts with prevention orientation to community problems. These critics argue that a prevention framework, quote, implies experts fixing the independent variables to make the dependent variables come out right. So kind of stopping there, dependent variables for our non-research methods heads / you should know this, dependent variable being, I don't know, maybe drinking too much or drunk driving, whatever. It's the outcome. It's that interventions are trying to address. And the independent variable, I don't know, it can be impulsivity in a person, lack of health literacy, or something related to that person or maybe that group. Empowerment recognizes the capabilities that exist among individuals, groups, organizations, and communities, and how societal barriers are in place that hinder growth. Discussion on empowerment theory have further elaborated that empowerment is developed through culturally focused groups, activities, and contexts, as well as, quote, enhancing wellness instead of fixing problems, identifying strengths instead of categorizing risk factors, and searching for environmental influences instead of blaming victims. Empowerment is identified through or among three interdependent subcategories at the community, organizational, and psychological levels. So kind of the idea of this empowerment theory is kind of analyzing kind of the strengths of particular organizations, communities, groups, individuals, rather than kind of just list like risk factors. And risk factors in general kind of operating at an individual level and sometimes at kind of a group level as well. So the idea here is to kind of build the strengths already present within these communities and identify environmental barriers that decrease the person to engage in healthy behaviors or increase the likelihood of risky behaviors. So it's kind of trying to understand quote unquote risks and strengths within their developmental context, within their environment. Looking at a specific example, Lardier in 2021 examined the role of intrapersonal and cognitive psychological empowerment, community civic engagement, and ethnic identity on 30-day drug use among a sample of youth of color, about 75% Hispanic, between ages between 14 and 18 years of age. The researchers tested indirect and direct association between constructs. The results revealed that both intrapersonal and cognitive psychological empowerment were associated with lower rates of 30-day substance use, mediated by ethnic identity and community civic engagement. So broadly stated, what these researchers found that higher rates of positive ethnic identity and community civic engagement, being active in community and being active in community implies a whole lot of other variables, but kind of advocacy, but ultimately kind of empowerment. We've talked about this before with previous research of racial minorities in the U.S. And indigenous people in the U.S. We're in kind of those kind of resources in that community, kind of building it up and further developing it, kind of decreasing the risk of negative developmental outcomes. So in this case here, we have civic engagement at the community level and ethnic identity, psychological empowerment, and intrapersonal empowerment, decreasing the risk or decreasing the rates of substance use across 30 days. So without getting too deep into stats nerdland, mediation can be thought of as kind of the third variable between a correlation. So say variable A is correlated with variable B. And the question is then why? What are the underlying processes that explain the correlation between those variables? So that's kind of mediation is kind of the idea. So in this case here, the mediation variables are ethnic identity and community civic engagement. And just again, broadly stated, looking at this, you can see in the lower left-hand corner, psychological empowerment being mediated through community civic engagement, see that arrow, and then through 30-day substance use. So a sense of psychological empowerment increasing through increased rates of community civic engagement, which then in return decreases 30-day substance use. At the top left-hand corner, you can see psychological empowerment being mediated through ethnic identity and then ultimately decreasing 30-day substance use. So intrapersonal psychological empowerment, decreasing 30-day substance abuse by increasing ethnic identity. So that's mediation, basically. It's that third variable in between two correlations. Now, there are far more complicated mediation studies, but this is now research methods class kind of broad overview situation. With the ultimate point being that, again, empowerment being predictive of substance use, which can then be reconnected back to that kind of dislocation argument of addiction. Next, let's talk about drinking among teenagers and adolescents broadly. Many adults have concerns over the influence of peers in promoting delinquent activity and drug and alcohol use. The question is, do adolescents develop interests and attitudes because friends influence them, or do people with similar interests and tastes become friends? That is, what comes first, joining a clique or being interested in a clique's activities? Study indicates that both selection and socialization are at work across a variety of attitudinal and behavioral domains. For example, adolescents who already drink are more likely to pick friends who drink, but also spending time with drinkers increases adolescents' own drinking. Smokers who spend time with non-smokers are more likely to quit. Socialization is believed to be far stronger over day-to-day preferences and things like music than over behaviors that adults worry about. So kind of the idea here is, why do people or kids start drinking or whatever, smoking or drug use? And we're pressed for time here, so we're going to go through all of it here. But kind of this research here, kind of broadly stated, suggesting that adolescents who already drink are going to look for friends who drink. They're engaged in that activity. People who are drinking for similar reasons, maybe with similar backgrounds, are at similar levels of educational performance at the time. Thus, you're going to select people who are kind of like you. Now, at the same time, being around other adolescents who drink increases your probability of drinking at higher rates. And conversely, for example, being around non-drinkers or non-smokers decreases the probability of smoking and or drinking. Now, I will say, but broadly stated, that kind of socialization and peer influences is typically stronger for more mundane things such as music, rather than very, very risky behaviors such as like drunk driving or something along those lines. Ads for alcohol and tobacco, as well as anti-smoking commercial messages, have been shown to change teenagers' behaviors about drinking and smoking. Not super strong effect size, but has some influence. Impacts evaluation of the social approval of drug use. Pointing out the motives of drug companies seems to be an effective method by which to decrease rates of smoking and drinking. Repeatedly overhyping use can actually make adolescent substance use far more common than it is. It gives this idea of a normative message. However, it is hard to know whether changing adolescents' exposure to messages about drinking and smoking actually changes their behavior, because it's difficult to systematically expose some teens to ads. So kind of the idea here is that, yes, there has been, so research suggests that commercial messages about tobacco use and alcohol use can increase the perception that drug use, or broadly stated, is approved by society. So, it's on TV, therefore everybody likes it, it's a cool time, blah, blah, blah. It's a normal thing to do. Now, some research suggests that ways to kind of challenge this perception is to do the classic, almost like a kind of iconoclastic kind of like view of drug companies. So telling your kid like, oh, you know why they do that? Because they want to make a lot of money for you. They're lying. It's kind of like, they're coming out to get you or whatever. So kind of like almost like a pro-social adversarial relationship with these companies. So not saying like, oh, don't do it because it's bad or whatever, but maybe, not saying, but kind of combining maybe that, or emphasizing the idea that these companies have alternative motives to present themselves that way, to make you believe this, and that thus to increase your drug use, alcohol use, drinking or smoking, and whatever, make money off it or something along those lines. And are you going to let yourself get manipulated? Are you going to get punked out by this drug company? It's kind of the idea here. Now, also, almost counterintuitively to many parents, kind of overhyping the rates of alcohol substance use can potentially have a negative effect, aka maybe potentially increase the social perception or social approval of drug use, because basically what we were saying is everybody's doing it. Therefore, okay, everybody's doing it, then it's cool, it's fine. It's a normal part of adolescent, and why are you wasting your time if every single person in the planet is doing it? So you're basically overhyping it, can kind of have a potentially a counteractive effect, or a counterintuitive effect that you're again kind of implying that everybody's using it, it's widespread, it's normative, it's approved. So why are you wasting your time trying to stop me using this drug? Relatedly, alcohol companies' arguments. So drink industries in India, Nigeria, the UK, Thailand, South Africa, and Mexico, for example, have resisted regulation of marketing, claiming that the industry is responsible and that self-regulation is effective. This is a similar argument to the tobacco industry. However, research suggests that there's a strong relationship between age at first use of alcohol and the prevalence of lifetime alcohol abuse and alcohol dependence. The younger the age at onset of drinking, the higher the likelihood of alcohol dependence or adult dependency of alcohol. So kind of the idea here is drug companies, for self-evident reasons, saying, oh, no, we don't need to decrease our marketing, targeting, whatever, maybe children or whatever, just marketing in general. Self-regulation is kind of sufficient. And kind of one counter argument is that a predictor of alcohol dependence in adulthood is the age in which you start drinking. So the earlier you drink, the more likely you are to experience alcohol abuse and alcohol dependence in adulthood. So basically the idea here is you want to push it back as far as possible. So when and if a person drinks, that they can drink in a more responsible way to kind of decrease the risk for numerous negative health outcomes. All right, let's break down AA a little bit. That is Alcoholics Anonymous. Self-help groups like AA have become very popular and widespread. For example, there are other similar groups such as Narcotics Anonymous, Gamblers Anonymous, Compulsive Shoppers Anonymous. Composed of peers with similar problems. Often, however, these peers are not professional therapists. This is based on, quote, the 12 steps method, but little research demonstrates its effectiveness. It, in general, fares no better than cognitive behavioral therapy. And up to about 68% of people engaging in this program drop out within the first 3 months. Moreover, people who participate in studies on the effectiveness of Alcohol Anonymous may be more likely to seek professional help, therefore more motivated to decrease or quit drinking, and therefore actually be even actually inflating the effectiveness of this kind of 12-step AA program. So kind of the idea here is that people who show up to study are much more motivated people who are committed to this and far more likely to decrease at least their rates of drinking, thus potentially biasing your sample and overestimating the rates of effectiveness of AA. There are other different relapse programs who have different theoretical orientation. Controlled drinking programs encourage people to set limits and drink moderately. Can be effective for many people. These types of programs teach people skills to cope with life stress and tolerate negative emotions, at least as effective, and they have been found to be at least as effective as 12-step programs. Relapse prevention treatment assumes people will, quote, slip up in plans accordingly. The lapse does not equal equal total relapse. Rebound after relapse and avoid situations that tempt you. Abstinence violation effect equals I slipped up, guess I'm back to drinking. So the big distinction here is the idea that just because one, you can engage in light to moderate drinking, you can set limits. It's not that, okay, I drink one time, I'm back. I'm for sure going to be, getting blackout drunk every single time. And consequently, there's kind of different interpretations of people drinking too much or drinking at all, something along those lines, quote unquote, slipping up. And the interpretation of these programs, the controlled drinking and relapse programs, is that a lapse does not necessarily mean that you completely relapse, but rather you should just kind of avoid temptation or environments wherein you're tempted to drink in the future, versus maybe an abstinence violation being like, well, you're in or you're out, right? It's all or nothing. You drink, you're for sure going to go back all the way. So therefore, it's like, okay, well, I slipped up one time. With this kind of, if you're in or you're out, therefore you drink and you're back at it. One interpretation can be, well, I drank one time. I guess I'm back to full-time drinking now, because once you drink one time, you're automatically going to drink a lot. Is kind of their argument against why that theoretical approach to the AA is not effective. And research suggests that both this that this kind of a controlled drinking relapse prevention is at least as effective as AA programs. Our final type of intervention we're going to cover is ideas like brief interventions. So, for example, these can be given at primary care facilities to individuals attending for reasons other than alcohol-related problems. After examining 19 trials that included approximately 5.5 thousand individuals, Bertholet in 2005 concluded that these interventions were effective in reducing alcohol consumption measured at 6 months and 12 months after the intervention. So kind of the idea here is that maybe a person comes to a hospital or some kind of care facility for unrelated illness related to alcohol, or maybe something related to alcohol. Maybe they fell or something like that, or I don't know, drank too much and vomited or all that, to go to the hospital. And kind of the idea is that when you're in the hospital being treated for whatever the physical health consequences of drinking was, you can also receive some kind of intervention at the same time. And this study found that kind of approach, that dual model approach, decreased rates of alcohol consumption after 12 months following the intervention. But let's get into a little more depth here, looking at the specific forms of trials. Bowen in 2014 reported a trial in which 286 participants were randomly assigned to one of three groups. That is the traditional 12-step facilitation program, kind of like AA situation, cognitive behavioral relapse, CBT, and mindfulness-based relapse prevention, MBRP. At 6 months follow-up, the CBT and MBRP groups both had lower relapse rates than the 12-step groups. And after 12 months, MBRP was outperforming both of the other groups. So this research, this study found that the cognitive behavioral therapy and MBRP trial intervention outperformed the traditional, not going to say traditional, but the more common, I guess, understood 12-step kind of AA program. However, it should be noted that some research has found that there are adverse effects associated with mindfulness-based programs. So it's important not to think of mindfulness as happens again, kind of in like pop psych situation, thinking you found the magical cure, and mindfulness is going to fix everything. Far more complicated and more challenging to adjust behaviors for reasons we've talked about with the health onion and these macro systems, that all these other variables impact behavior, health-related behavior, and in this case here, alcoholism or heavy drinking. And specifically, some studies have suggested that mindfulness can have negative impacts on some people. But in this study here, mindfulness-based relapse prevention, again, outperformed the 12-step traditional or AA-like program. All right, everyone. Thank you for listening, and I hope you have a great week. Thanks. Bye.